If you have ever sat at a table with 12 people and nobody thought that was unusual, you already understand something most people do not. My family has 19 people fed 3 times a day without a microwave, a grocery delivery, or a freezer section. We bake before the chores and we cook by what the week holds. Somewhere in this kitchen, there is a room below the house where winter lives. There is an hour before sunrise that most families no longer keep. One of those things will surprise you. Let me show you how it actually works. 19 people and 1 table. People hear 19 and they picture disaster. That is the wrong picture. What they imagine is 19 strangers dropped into a kitchen without a system. What I am describing is a household that has been running the same way for decades, with roles that everyone understands and responsibilities that rotate by age and season. Grandparents, parents, older children who work, younger children who help. Not everyone sits at once. The kitchen does not serve a single meal and close. It runs in rounds. Morning before the barn, midday as the main meal, evening finishing what the day used. What that requires is that more than one person knows how the kitchen works. The older daughters know the schedule. The younger children learn it. My husband and sons know what they are walking into when they come back from the barn, and they know it will be ready. The extra mouths bring extra hands. That is the part people miss. A household of 19 is not harder to feed than a household of 4 in every way. You lose the waste. You gain the help. Bulk is efficient. A pot of soup that is too large for 4 people is exactly right for 19. A baking day that produces 10 loaves is not more trouble than 2. The oven is running either way. What disappeared from most American homes was the distributed kitchen, the one where more than one woman knew the recipes and the children were taught to be useful before they were taught to be guests. That kind of kitchen does not run by accident. It runs because someone decided it would. But before I tell you what we eat, I want to tell you about the hour nobody mentions, the hour before anyone comes to the table. Before the sun comes up. Before anyone stepped into the barn, something was already on the stove, not because we planned it the night before, because we always plan it the night before. That is not a small distinction. When farm animals need tending before first light, and in our home they do, the kitchen has to be running before the chores are done, not after. By the time you milk cows and feed livestock and come back cold and tired, you do not want to start cooking. You want something that was already started. The oatmeal goes on the back burner the evening before, low enough that it will not scorch, thick enough to hold warmth through the night. The bread was already made. The eggs come from the hens. The coffee gets started as soon as someone reaches the stove. That hour is not romantic. It is cold floor under bare feet, lamplight instead of daylight, the sound of a pot that has been simmering while the house slept. There is no lingering. The people going out to the barn need to eat before they go, and the person who started the kitchen is already thinking about the next thing. The pre-dawn kitchen routine disappeared from most homes, not because families wanted to stop, but because the animals left first. When there is no livestock, there is no reason to be up before sunrise. The alarm moved later, the coffee maker got a timer, and the meal that was warm when the work was done became something you reheated after the gym. In our house, the animals did not leave, so the hour did not leave either. The chores take between 1 and 2 hours. When they come back in, the table needs to be ready, and what is on that table has not changed much in 40 years, because it works. The meal that has to hold until noon. Have you ever eaten a breakfast that left you hungry by 9 o'clock? Then you know it was the wrong breakfast. If someone is going out to do hard labor for hours without a break, a light breakfast is not a smaller version of a good breakfast. It is a failure to feed the person. The right breakfast is dense, warm, starchy, and protein-heavy. Fried potatoes from whatever was boiled and set aside the night before. Eggs scrambled in bulk. When you are feeding a table before chores, you do not make 12 separate preparations. Bread already made. Cooked oatmeal or cornmeal mush for those who want something softer. When butchering season has come and gone, sausage or scrapple as well. Coffee with real cream in quantity. None of this is what modern people call breakfast food. And that is the thing worth sitting with. Potatoes and bread and cooked cereal are not inherently breakfast foods. They became breakfast foods because they worked. They kept people upright and useful until noon without stopping to eat again. The category came from the function. The sound of it is the particular sizzle of cold potato in a hot cast iron pan. Higher, sharper than anything else in the kitchen. The sound that means the stove is at the right temperature. The plate is heavy. It sits in the stomach the right way. What made that breakfast disappear was the change in what mornings require. When no one does physical work before 9, a dense breakfast feels like too much. When convenience food is cheap and fast, cooked potatoes from last night feel like trouble. The food did not change. The work did. What you do not see at that breakfast table is waste. Not because we are careful people, though we are. Because we have already decided what yesterday's food becomes today. That kitchen runs backward and forward at the same time. People always ask me if the work is hard. I suppose the honest answer is that I never separated the work from the living. The meal and the chore and the season, they are the same thing. Sakuri. Nothing in this kitchen gets thrown away. In our kitchen, stale bread was not garbage. It was tomorrow's breakfast, or a thickener for soup, or something the chickens would eat if we had used it every other way first. The zero-waste kitchen is not a philosophy. It is a logical system. When 19 people eat 3 meals a day and you cannot simply drive to a store when something runs short, the second use of every ingredient is part of the original plan. Yesterday's oatmeal goes into a skillet, pressed flat, fried until crisp at the edges and warm through the center. It is not the same dish it was the night before. It is often better. The outside crisps in a way fresh oatmeal cannot. Bread heels become bread pudding or go into soup to thicken the broth. Leftover boiled potatoes, boiled with tomorrow already in mind, become hash in the morning. Soup bones go back into water a second time, and what comes off that second draw is thinner, but still useful, good enough to cook grains in or start the next pot. The creativity modern food culture now celebrates in zero-waste cooking was always the byproduct of pressure, not inspiration. The pressure came first. The cleverness followed. What changed was abundance. When food is cheap enough to throw away, the planning that prevented waste becomes invisible. The second meal stopped being urgent, and then it stopped existing. But there is a part of that economy that happens underground, literally, below the kitchen, the room where winter lives. The room below the house. People who have never had a root cellar do not understand what it does. It does not just hold food. It holds the decision you made in August, and whether that decision was right shows in February. The cellar is a second kitchen running in reverse. While the kitchen above produces meals from what we have, the cellar builds the supply of what we will need. The two run together all year. What is down there in winter? Rows of mason jars, green beans, tomatoes, corn, applesauce, pickled beets, apple butter, jams, broth, canned chicken, canned pork. Crocks of sauerkraut waited and working quietly, potatoes in wooden crates, beets and carrots packed in sand to keep from drying out, dried beans in cloth sacks, smoked meat from butchering season. The smell is distinct. Earth, cold, something faintly fermented, vinegar underneath, wood that has absorbed decades of winter. It is the smell of food put away correctly and still doing its job. What people miss is that the cellar is not passive. Temperature needs managing. Jars need checking for seal failure. Stock needs rotating. New jars behind the old ones used first. A cellar not managed will lose food, and losing food in January when the garden is buried is not a small inconvenience. The supermarket made the root cellar obsolete by solving the problem it had been solving. Year-round produce, freezer sections, canned goods at any hour. All of that replaced what the cellar did, and the cellar became a relic, then a curiosity, then something people build as a hobby. In our household, it never became a hobby. The food still needs to come from somewhere in February. Here is what I want you to understand before we go further. None of this is about being different from modern people. Every jar in that cellar was put there because someone was going to need it, and that someone was usually going to be hungry in the middle of a month when there was nothing easy to reach for. The bread that never stopped. We bake twice a week. We always have. For 19 people, that means 8 to 12 loaves per bake. The oven runs most of the morning. The bread day dictates the rest of the day. You do not plan the bread around the schedule. You plan the schedule around the bread. When the dough needs attention, you give it attention. Our bread is denser than what comes sliced in a plastic bag, with more substance under the knife. It satisfies faster, so a slice goes further than 2 slices of commercial bread. It also goes stale faster. No preservatives, but that is not a disadvantage here. Stale bread is tomorrow's bread pudding, or bread soup, or the base of a stuffing. The bread moves forward, whether fresh or not. The smell of baking bread while the kitchen handles other things is layered. Yeast, warmth, then the browning smell that starts about 20 minutes before the loaves are done. You learn to recognize the stages by smell without checking the clock. The sound of a loaf thumped on the bottom to test whether it is hollow tells you more than a timer does. The weight of a fresh loaf, still warm, slightly resistant when you press the crust. That weight is information. Homebread baking collapsed across most of American life between the 1940s and 1970s because commercial sliced bread became cheap, soft, and consistently available. The home baker became unnecessary. In kitchens like ours, the math never changed. The freshness is genuinely different for hard work and real appetite. The routine persisted because stopping it would have cost more than continuing. Bread gets eaten fast by this many people. What feeds them between bread days is a different kind of thinking, the kind where one pot has to do the work of 3. One pot for 20. People see a big pot of soup and think it is the easy meal. It is the most calculated meal. Every ingredient in that pot was put there on purpose. And the purpose was not flavor first. The purpose was feeding everyone, holding through reheating, stretching with a little more water and another loaf of bread if extra people arrived, and accepting whatever the week's leftovers offered without complaint. A good soup pot is flexible. A good soup cook builds toward that flexibility in advance. In Pennsylvania, Dutch kitchens, chicken corn soup is something you learn young and make many times before you make it well. Cut noodles, chicken from a bird that worked before it was eaten, sweet corn from a jar in the cellar, finished with cream so the color shifts from clear to pale gold, the thickness that builds from the starch in the noodles, the smell an hour before it is ready, different from the smell when the cream goes in. These things are not incidental, they are the dish. On heavy work days, it might be bean and ham hock soup that has been going since morning, or potato soup with smoked meat, or vegetable broth with barley built from the second draw off the bones. The pot is the tool. The skill is making the week's available contents taste like they were chosen rather than assembled. What disappeared was not soup. Soup survived. What disappeared was the big pot as the anchor of the day, the thing the kitchen organized itself around. As households shrank and pre-made soups became cheap, the large pot became impractical. At our table, the math still favors the pot. I want to stop here because what I am about to tell you is the part nobody sees from the outside. The food is not the hardest part. Knowing who is tired, who is working harder this week, who will not say they are hungry, that is the skill the food depends on. What Sunday means in a kitchen. People say Sunday is a day of rest. In our kitchen, it is the day we cook for whoever is not us. On a church Sunday, the hosting family feeds everyone who attends, not only family, not only people who were specifically invited, but anyone who came. You do not know exactly how many. You prepare for more than you expect. The Sunday table is not a showcase, it is a function. In many communities, the spread is nearly identical from one hosting family to the next. Peanut butter mixed with marshmallow cream until soft enough to spread, sliced bologna and hard-boiled eggs on platters, pickled red beets, bread and butter pickles, white bread, pie, chouflée if the household makes one, apple if they do not. Coffee in quantity. The sameness is the point. The fact that the food is predictable, that everyone knows what to expect, that no hosting family distinguishes themselves with something unusual. That is not a failure of imagination. That is hospitality working correctly. When people have driven a distance and they are hungry, the comfort is in knowing what is on the table. Familiarity is a form of welcome. What faded from most of American life was the obligation to feed whoever arrived. Open hospitality, the assumption that anyone coming on a gathering day would be fed without having been invited to eat, became awkward to maintain as households shrank and schedules tightened. The Sunday table shrank from community to family to couple. The obligation became optional and then unusual. Sunday feeding is obligatory here. But there is a different kind of obligation that comes when someone is sick or has lost something, or when a neighbor's barn burned, and what the kitchen does then is a different conversation entirely. When the neighbors needed feeding. We have taken food to funerals more times than I can count. To families after a barn fire, after a difficult birth, after a harvest that failed. Nobody called first. Nobody asked what we were bringing. The food just went. This is not sentiment. It is a description of how community food functions as a practical system. When a family loses their barn, they have lost a season of work and a winter of shelter for their animals. The community rebuilds it. What is less talked about? While the men raise the barn, the women are running the food, not as a secondary contribution, but as the logistical support that makes the workday possible. 30 men can raise a barn. 30 men cannot raise a barn if no one has fed them since morning. The food that goes to a family in crisis comes from the same cellar the household depends on. The casserole carried across a field in a towel did not come from extra. It came from what the family was planning to use. The jars packed into a box for a bereaved household are jars that will not be on our shelf in March. Giving is not abundance overflowing. It is a genuine calculation made without resentment. What travels well? A noodle dish or baked beans that hold heat in transit, a whole pie carried carefully, bread in a cloth, sometimes jars from the cellar pulled specifically for this purpose. Not the best jars and not the oldest, the most useful ones to a family that cannot cook right now. What replaced this in most of American life was formal charity. Organizations, scheduled delivery, systems. Those things do real work. But what they cannot replicate is the neighbor who knows what your family eats, who knows you do not have enough left to cook through grief, who brings it before you realize you needed it. The informal obligation faded as community ties grew thinner. The food still goes somewhere. It just does not usually come from the same cellar the giver is depending on. All of this, the bread days, the cellar, the soup pot, the Sunday meal, the food we carry to a neighbor, comes down to one thing, and I have been trying to find the right word for it for most of my life. Every family has a thing that holds the rest together. For years, I could not have told you what ours was. I think I can tell you now. What holds it together? It is not the food. The food is the evidence. What holds a household of 19 people together is the daily decision that each person is someone else's responsibility, before the barn and after the barn, at the table and through the winter, and when the neighbor's harvest fails. The operating assumption is that the person next to you is your concern, and you are theirs, and that concern gets expressed through practical things, through food most days. The kitchen is where that assumption gets renewed every morning, before the light, before the chores, before anyone has said a word. The stove is on for someone else. Someone got up when it was still dark and started something warm because people were going to need it. That act, repeated every day for decades, is not a tradition. It is a value expressed in the only language the morning has room for. I think about what it felt like to walk into that kitchen as a child and find it already warm, to know that someone had already thought about the morning before the morning arrived. That kind of certainty, that your hunger will be anticipated, that your return from the barn will be met with something ready, is not a small thing. What changed in the broader world was not that people stopped loving each other. It was that the daily expression of that care stopped being organized around the kitchen. The morning became individual. Feeding the household became whoever had time. The obligation dispersed, and then became invisible, and then became optional. And when it became optional, it often became absent. In kitchens like ours, it never became optional, not because we are better people, but because the practical requirements of a large working household do not leave room for the morning to be individual. Someone has to be up. Something has to be on the stove. The obligation is built into the structure of the day, and over time, the structure built the obligation into us. Some of what I have described has changed, even here. Some of the younger ones have gone. The cellar has fewer jars than it used to. These things are true, but the principle has not changed, and the principle is not Amish. It belongs to anyone who has ever gotten up before they wanted to because someone else needed the stove on. You had kitchens like this too once. Some of you still do. The food is not the point. The food is how you show the point. Every morning, before the barn, that is what the stove is on for. If your grandmother's kitchen ran on a schedule nobody wrote down but everybody knew, if the table was ready before anyone asked whether it would be, I would like to hear about it. Tell me what she made. Tell me who else was at the table. Some of us are still counting.